today. I've actually learned quite a bit more about UDL, so it's really been a pleasure to work with her on this as well. So welcome everyone to the ACRL virtual webinar today, From Reflection to Action, Universal Design for Learning and Education Librarianship. My name is Eric Silverberg, and here with Jennifer Shimada. And our presentation today is going to look at how Universal Design for Learning can be used by education librarians as a framework to reflect on and evaluate our library instruction, particularly with education students. Now, education librarianship occupies an interesting duality. We're librarians working with students, and we are educators setting an example to future educators. So this means we can frame our instruction as suggestions to these future educators as how to teach information literacy, and as we'll see today with Jennifer's example, how to teach the research process. So by way of an outline for our presentation, our remarks will last about 30 minutes. So I'll begin by translating Universal Design for Learning from the K through 8, K through 12 context to library instruction in higher education. And then Jennifer will speak for another 15 minutes, demonstrating an example of how she uses UDL in library instruction around education research. We'll then open up the floor to hear from all of you about the ways that you make space for reflection in your instruction and perhaps how you use UDL through a discussion. And then finally, we'll finish up with a Q&A. So if at any point you have questions as we're speaking, go ahead and drop them into the chat, and Wai-Fen and Dawn will collect those for the Q&A at the end. Okay, next slide, thanks. So let's take a moment and look at where UDL comes from and how it can be translated to library instruction. So Universal Design for Learning comes out of the universal design movement and architecture. And universal design aims to create barrier-free buildings, a kind of inclusive architecture that through design enables universal access to buildings. So the classic example of universal design pictured here is the ramp, right? Which not only enables access for people using a wheelchair to enter the school, but also beneficial for older people, people pushing a stroller, people moving heavy equipment, etc. So the ramp, a simple alteration that in fact broadens the accessibility of a space, is an extremely useful metaphor to understand how Universal Design for Learning seeks to remove barriers during instruction. Next slide. Also relevant to us in education librarianship, universal design arose around the same time as the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, specifically found in Section 504, which was not enforced until 1977, thanks in large part to many disability rights organizations who staged protests around the country throughout the 1970s. Next slide. So it's from Section 504 that we have the Section 504 accommodations in schools for students with disabilities, and it's really sort of like the legal framework that gave rise to universal design. Section 504 states, right, no otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall solely by reason of his or her disability be excluded from the participation in, denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So Universal Design for Learning arises from this history as a framework to remove barriers to education. At its heart, Universal Design for Learning offers multiple entry points and empowers students to advocate for what they need in an educational context. It holds that each individual is unique in how they learn, arrives to class from a wide variety of life experiences, and thus instruction should be oriented in a way that anticipates such variety among students. And now we see here on the screen, we will turn to what Universal Design for Learning actually includes, and we'll look at how it can provide, what it provides for us in library instruction. So UDL is a distinct concept that arose in K through 12 throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And in fact, my introduction to UDL came during my time as a special education teacher and the training that I received while working with students with autism. For our presentation today, it's going to be beneficial to translate this K through 12 language to something that's more applicable to library instruction and higher ed. In K through 12, you hear teachers say, I know my students. And in libraries, we don't really have that luxury, which to me means that a framework that calls on us to reflect on our teaching is all the more essential to ensure our instruction is inclusive, given that we will not know our students and should not be making assumptions about them. We won't really be able to get in depth as a K through 12 teacher would be. Next slide. So UDL's guiding premise is, you'll see across the screen on the far left, multiple means of engagement. In the center there, multiple means of representation, multiple ways that we're representing material throughout our lesson. And the last, multiple means of action and expression, meaning multiple avenues for students to participate and express what they're learning. So what we see across these three domains, which are central to UDL, is an emphasis on student choice, and in our planning, preparing multiple entry points, multiple pathways, multiple ramps for students to access content and the activities. So next slide. We'll start with engagement on the far left, and we'll translate engagement from the K through 12 to the higher education context. So here we're talking about the why of learning, and that's really especially important for higher education, particularly education graduate students who are juggling full-time jobs and are very discerning in their expectations about class, given that they've completed undergrad and have rich experiences beyond the classroom. In K through 12, we might have talked about this in terms of the need to have high interest materials to recruit interest. In library instruction for education grad students, we need to optimize the relevance and value of what we're teaching. So for example, we're talking about sustaining effort and persistence. K through 12 talks about varying the rigor of exercises. We don't have that luxury of time in library instruction. So in higher education, it can be considered setting clear goals for the time that we have with a group, making that explicit. And also talking about self-regulation. This is crucial, and Jennifer will actually give a wonderful example of this in just a few moments. Giving time for self-reflection to students, for students to reflect on the goals that you've laid out at the beginning of an instruction session, how well, and that allows them to determine how well they understood the material from a library session and where they need more from you. Next slide. So Jennifer's part of the presentation will also look at comprehension. And this is about the what, the representation during instruction. So this actually looks very similar between K through 12 and higher ed. And here the idea is that you're activating background knowledge as a foundation for new content. So grad students, as I said, come from a variety of life backgrounds, experiences with formal education and professional experience. So it's really critical to draw on this prior experience with research, whether that be what they've done formally in school or what they've already been doing as part of their professional work. And the last, talking about providing multiple means of action and expression. Here we're talking about the how of learning. And executive functioning is one way that, and Jennifer will elaborate more on this too. It's very common in K through 8 because executive functioning includes the cognitive skills around planning, focus, following instructions, juggling multiple tasks. And in K through 8, we really scaffold activities with the attention span of adolescents in mind, so with very clear rules and expectations in the classroom. This is not so much the case, hopefully, in higher education. However, library research does not follow a straight line. So students arriving to class that have been working full-time, our parents have had a variety of formal education experiences in the past. Executive functioning actually does play a role in planning by offering sort of benchmarks in terms of what's going on in class as you're moving through a lesson. As well as what's most important, what Jennifer will cover more, is also providing, in terms of executive functioning, an opportunity again for students to reflect on process. What have been the steps so far? As you can see on the underneath executive functioning on the screen, right, the ability to enhance capacity for monitoring progress. So building into the lesson a focus on how to monitor progress throughout a lesson. So with that, I will now turn it over to Jennifer, who will give an example of how she applies the concepts of engagement, representation, and multiple means of expression and action in one of her lesson plans.
Thanks, Eric. So as Eric said, I'm going to provide a case study of how I use UDL instruction, but I want to start by giving some context about my institution. We're a fairly unique institution, and I think that the case study I'll share has some broader applicability, but is definitely within the context of my institution. Relay is an independent graduate school of education focused on teacher and school leader training. Our students all work at schools full-time as either teachers of record or teacher residents, so teachers in training. And they're in graduate school with Relay. So they are often overworked and overwhelmed. Anyone who's been an early career teacher knows the number of demands that they're facing. Our programs are practice-based, which means our student assignments are focused more on skills such as designing lesson plans rather than skills like conducting research. And then Relay has a centrally designed curriculum. And so the librarians work closely with our curriculum design faculty to incorporate information literacy into courses. So we don't do traditional one-shot instruction, which I think is actually more aligned with UDL anyway, not to do that. Instead, we either create online asynchronous resources that students engage with in their classes, or we co-design synchronous instruction that is taught by faculty instead of librarians. We only have 2 librarians with 2,000 students, and so this makes it much more scalable and sustainable, and it gives me the opportunity to sort of go really in depth in what a case study might look like over the course of a semester, but I think there are things that I'll talk about that would be applicable even if you're just doing a one-shot. And finally, while this is a graduate level program, Relay students have a wide variety of experiences with using the library and research. So some of our students might be career changers who have a PhD in another field. Some of them haven't looked at a library since they did their core undergraduate classes, lower level education courses a long time ago. So it's a wide range of experiences. Given the wide variety among our students, we prioritize designing our curriculum with UDL in mind. UDL, as Eric said, ensures that instruction is inclusive of all learners, no matter their previous experience with using libraries and research, no matter their current circumstances or how busy they are, or their learner variability. And by that, I mean differences in things like cultural backgrounds, neurodiversity, learning disabilities, preferences in how they learn. We just have a very wide variety of learners and want to design to accommodate them all. In addition, UDL's goal of creating expert learners is aligned with my vision for information literacy at my institution, which is to develop students into self-directed and socially aware lifelong learners who are able to critically evaluate information and are empowered to act as agents of change. So I just think those goals are very closely aligned. So what does that look like in practice for information literacy instruction? One of my favorite ways to think through the steps of the information search process that we teach our students, that many of you will probably know about, is Carol Kolthau's information search process. In this model, Kolthau outlines the thoughts, feelings, and actions students experience as they engage with the various phases of the research process. Kolthau states that many post-secondary students still need support with the process of information searching and not simply help. How do you use this library tool? Can you help me find one or two sources? They need support with the process as a whole. Bringing this into UDL terms, if you are aware of the thoughts and feelings that students might experience along the stages of this process, you can provide options for self-regulation, so helping students optimize motivation and have personal coping skills, even as they're dealing with feelings like uncertainty, confusion, frustration, and doubt that they might experience throughout the process. And you can also help guide their thoughts from vague and unfocused to focused through supporting executive functions, guiding appropriate goal setting for their information seeking, enhancing capacity for monitoring their progress towards meeting that goal. So with the information search process model in mind, Kolthau, in collaboration with Leslie Maniotis and Ann Kaspari, created a method for inquiry called guided inquiry design. Like Eric, I come from a K-12 background, so I use this with K-12 students, but it still highly informs how I teach even graduate students because I believe it is also aligned to universal design for learning. It incorporates those supports for self-regulation and executive functions that I mentioned on the previous slide, and also has a heavy focus on the UDL guideline around comprehension, activating background knowledge, highlighting patterns and big ideas, guiding information processing, and maximizing transfer and generalization. So in this model for inquiry, you start by opening the inquiry and immersing students in background knowledge. Then students begin to explore their topic, and only after they have that background knowledge do they develop a research question and begin gathering information to answer that question before finally creating and sharing their response and evaluating their process. I refer to this model a lot because too often I find that we have students start with identifying their research question without giving them that background knowledge that they need. In guided inquiry design, identify is the fourth step and not the first. So providing those supports for comprehension and background knowledge enables more students to be able to succeed, especially if they are new to the content area, as many of our students are. So let me give a more concrete example of how I use guided inquiry design and UDL in order to design instruction that is inclusive of all learners. So the capstone for our Masters of Arts in Teaching program is an action research project. In this case, in this course, our students, who again are all K-12 teachers, conduct action research focused on process and reflection over rigorous quantitative and qualitative methods. So our goal is to teach them a systematic approach to reflecting on their own practice that they can do on a consistent basis throughout their career, and not to have them be formal educational researchers. So what they do is identify a need or opportunity within their school or classroom, select an evidence-based strategy to address that need or opportunity, implement the strategy, and then analyze and reflect on the data that they gather. Again, our curriculum is centrally designed, and so this course was designed by me in partnership with several of our faculty members, and it is taught by a number of faculty members, but not by myself. So I don't implement this, but I did help to design this course. On this slide, you can see an outline of the course with the class sessions on the left and the aligned guided inquiry design steps on the right. This is a hybrid asynchronous and synchronous course where students engage in online asynchronous learning and then attend 7 course sessions. Given that this is such a large project, and again, teachers are doing this in their first or second year teaching many times, we intentionally scaffold those steps and break them down in alignment with the guided inquiry design method to facilitate self-regulation, sustaining effort and persistence, and executive functioning. On the following slides, I'm going to go more into detail on the portions of the course highlighted in green, since those are most aligned to information literacy. So the first class incorporates the open and immerse stages of guided inquiry design. We set the stage for the inquiry and begin to build students' background knowledge on the process that they will engage in. Because this is the opening, there is a heavy focus on the UDL column of engagement. We recruit interest by telling students why action research matters and provide them choice and autonomy in selecting their topics. We give them opportunities to collaborate with their peers, which supports sustaining effort and persistent, and to reflect on their practice as teachers, which promotes self-regulation. We also focus on comprehension, activating and supplying background knowledge that they will apply to this project. So practically speaking, in the first class, we give an overview of the teacher inquiry framework that is used to guide their process and list the criteria for a good research question, that it is compelling, actionable, and testable. And then we discuss that in order to ensure that a research question is compelling, teachers should ensure that they listen to themselves through self-reflection, through the community, and to the field. So before and during this class, they engage in a lot of guided self-reflection about their practice and how teaching is going for them to listen to themselves. Between this class and the next, they listen to their community and to the field. So they conduct community interviews to listen to what others around them have to say about what issues might be worth exploring in their action research project. And then listening to the field is where the library comes in. So in this stage of using the library for information gathering, we emphasize that they are just dipping into the scholarship, exploring according to the guided inquiry design process rather than gathering. So we ask them to review 2 tables of contents for 2 journals, 2 tables of contents for 2 books, and 2 titles and abstracts of 2 articles. We tell them that they're not reading full articles, they're just scanning and browsing. We talk about scholarship as a conversation and give the metaphor of just going around to the different rooms, listening in to see what the conversation is about, rather than going deeply into any one conversation. And they fill out this graphic organizer where they take notes on what they're hearing in that conversation. They both take notes on each individual source, but then they also think through, after they've gone through these sources, combined with them all as a whole, what are they thinking in regards to their research question? How is this research informing the process of selecting their research question? So from a UDL perspective, we are focusing on comprehension, activating and supplying background knowledge about their topic, and guiding information and processing through this graphic organizer. It also supports executive functioning, both by helping them manage information resources, they're tracking what they are finding on this graphic organizer, and guiding how they set their goals for this project through concrete steps for setting those goals. And finally, it supports self-regulation as we explicitly ask them to reflect on how their research is changing based on what they have researched so far. So after exploring, students have a much better sense of the topic they want to research, and we help them refine this even further by asking them to make sure their question is not only compelling, but actionable. They need to identify a specific evidence-based strategy that they're going to try in their classroom. We provide question stems to help them determine their research question. And slides like the one on the screen help with comprehension by highlighting critical features of the process of developing a research question. And they also continue to help students monitor where they are in relation to their goal, which supports executive functioning. So in order to determine what evidence-based strategy they're going to use, students go back into the literature and create an annotated bibliography. So we emphasize that now students are moving from exploring, gathering. So instead of dipping in and out of various conversations, they're picking one conversation to listen to more closely. And then this time they are reading articles from start to finish to see how it relates to their research. So we have them fill out another graphic organizer for their annotated bibliography that asks them to list their APA citation for each source, an evaluation of each source for its validity, relevance, and bias perspective, and a reflection on how the source relates to their research and what thoughts and questions it raises for them. For each section, there are links to LibGuides I've created on how to cite, analyze, and synthesize course sources. And then after they analyze each source separately, they also reflect on the sources taken together, what trends they are seeing, and how their research might build on or contradict what they have found. So again, a graphic organizer like this one supports comprehension and executive functions by guiding information processing and facilitating managing information and resources. It also supports expression and communication. Instead of simply saying, do an annotated bibliography, it has graduated levels of support with specific questions that students should answer and links to additional resources if they need further support in how to complete that graphic organizer. And finally, there are several questions throughout that encourage self-regulation by asking students to self-assess and reflect on how their research is going so far. So I'm not going to go into detail on most of the rest of the pieces of this project since they involve the library less, but from here, students finalize their research question, including the strategy they will use, the data they will collect on that strategy, implement their action research, collect their data, present their findings, and reflect on their process. The reflection on the process is just as emphasized as their actual findings. As I mentioned at the beginning, our goal for this project was to give teachers a systematic approach to reflecting on their own practice that they can use throughout their career as teachers, and not so much giving them background in rigorous quantitative and qualitative methods used by formal educational researchers and scholars. So we asked them questions about how this process makes them more effective practitioners and how they'll use this process to engage in continual improvement moving forward. Teaching is a really difficult career, and we are hoping to emphasize skills in self-regulation, such as optimizing motivation, facilitating personal coping skills, and self-assessment and regulation, and skills in executive functioning like goal setting, planning, monitoring progress that they can use throughout their careers. So, and you can see some of the example reflections on this screen. Our students do take away a lot from this process. It helps them feel more empowered in their classroom, giving them a process they can use going forward to solve issues that they might face in their classroom. They also learn the value of conducting literature reviews, even as practitioners. They don't have to reinvent the wheel when they're trying to find strategies that might work in their classroom. And finally, several students note how intimidated they were by the process when they first heard they were going to do action research, but that the way this course was designed with our emphasis on inclusive universal design for learning made it a whole lot more accessible. Doing graduate school on top of being an early career teacher is really hard, even without other barriers our students might face due to learning differences, personal circumstances, or differences in academic preparation. Designing with UDL in mind removes those barriers in learning that students might face so that they can become those empowered lifelong learners who are able to effectively use information resources to continually improve their practice as teachers and effectively advocate for themselves and their students. So that's my case study, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's going to lead us into our first discussion.
So at this point, we're going to have a facilitated discussion using the chat in Zoom. So the first question that we'd like you to respond to is how do you, given what Jennifer just showed in her example, and the opportunities at sort of each step throughout the curriculum that she shared, there's opportunities for students to reflect on the information search process. So you can think about, and please share, the opportunities that you give for students to reflect on learning, whether that be in a one-shot or in more like the embedded librarian role that Jennifer shared with us.
Looks like we do have a question in the chat. Oh, is that you, Eric? You wrote that. Okay. I was like, oh, yay, we got somebody. Let's see. Did you see that response?
Thank you, Teresa. If you feel comfortable, Teresa, please feel free to unmute or continue in the chat and explain anything that's been interesting that you've learned through that survey. Thank you, Melissa. Great, so through Melissa's example, right? is, again, going back to the why of education, the multiple means of engagement, multiple related readings that students can choose as a way to recruit interest in the topic. Thank you, Melissa. And Melissa, if you feel comfortable unmuting or wanting to share in the chat, I'm wondering if you've had any feedback from students on the ability to select readings.
Sure, I'm happy to hop on mic. Can you hear me, Eric?
Yes, great, thank you.
Okay, yeah. So I teach graduate courses in library and information science. I teach for the iSchool at the University of Illinois, and I teach a course on instruction. So this is all very meta, but my course attracts students who are going into a lot of different career paths. So I have academic librarians, public librarians, I have archive folks, museum folks. So some weeks I give them a choice of readings, and that way some of the readings are geared more towards academic libraries, some are geared towards public libraries. So that's why they have a choice, but it really helps build a sense of relevancy, right? Very UDL, because they're able to pick the readings that correspond with their career path or even their experience level with the subject. So sometimes I have kind of introductory readings, sometimes, and then there are more advanced readings. But the students really like having those choices of what they're going to read. It seems to be really motivating. And for me as an instructor, it's an easy way to customize the course when I have such a diverse student body.
Oh, thank you so much, Melissa. Teresa shares, students have shared they now feel better equipped to use the catalog to find materials and who to ask for help from the library. Take one more minute. One other thought that's come to mind from someone else about how do you provide opportunities for students to reflect on the learning? This can be like in Teresa's case, at the end of instruction, or as Melissa does sort of throughout the course. Does anyone provide for any reflection during instruction? Middle of your activities or courses? I guess what we would call formative assessment. Okay, seeing not so much, we'll go on to the second discussion question that Jennifer will lead for us.
So our next discussion question is, what are ways that you reflect on the inclusivity of your teaching? So maybe you use UDL as a framework. Maybe there's something else you use, but what are ways that you consider whether or not your teaching is inclusive? Again, feel free to put it in chat or come off mute. Eric, do you want to share a little bit about how, oh, hold on. I was just going to say, Eric, I know you have a process if you wanted to share a little bit about that.
This is one that I was thinking about, and I just did a project on at our library to reflect on the number of students that actually participate during a session. And like I put in the comment, that can be participated in a variety of different ways. That can be, kind of classically raising your hand and sharing something with the whole class, participating in speaking with a partner or in small groups, or participating in a writing activity. And what I'm really interested in calculating is, like, out of the total students that are in the classroom, how many have participated at least once in those categories. And to me, that really gets to about inclusion, right? There's multiple entry points to the class. There's many different ways to participate. And if I come away and I feel, wow, only 2 people spoke in front of the class, and that was the only opportunity to, the 2 questions I had, 2 kind of full group questions, that really wasn't many ways to enter the class. So the range of different of ways to participate is something that I really prioritize.
I appreciate that, especially that you're also considering participation broadly for the multiple means of action and expression, whether that's speaking or writing. I feel like for me, also giving students those different types of opportunities, given that some process verbally, some process in writing is really helpful. Teresa has also shared in the chat of sharing the PowerPoint with faculty so they can share with their students after a one-shot, and doing this sometimes beforehand. And that's a really great way for multiple means of engagement, so that students have the content in different modalities. And anonymous polls also. I try to balance anonymous polls and ways to contribute for times where students might need a little bit more safety and security to share their thoughts, with doing things that build more community, and having students share things that maybe are less scary to share or easier to share in breakout rooms or in person. It's not anonymous, depending on the purpose of the question. All right. And then Teresa Mastrinato has short videos for another teaching modality. Teresa, you want to share more about that?
Well, I try to include, like, if I'm teaching a concept, I'll have a short 1-minute video. It just kind of breaks up the class a little bit, and it gives the students who are more visual learners a chance, instead of just having a PowerPoint or kind of explaining it to them. I think the short videos, 1-minute videos that I can find, really help kind of inform that. And then I include that in the PowerPoint that I'll pass on to the instructor that I think the other Teresa said, so that, they have the link to the video that they can go back and watch it there.
And Emily, no pressure to come off mute, but if you want to come off mute and talk about your survey. She's got, you can read what she put into the chat.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, so I just ask, what's something you learned? So that's part of, your first discussion question. And then, what's a question you still have? And that can be a good way for me to gauge, right? Sometimes it's a question that's not related to anything we're doing, but is, something else in the library they have questions about. So then I can give that information without taking too much class time, but it also provides an opportunity to, like I said, maybe link to LibGuides that might be helpful, link to some other materials that might let them kind of sit with that information a little bit more than they were able to in a potentially fairly fast-paced one shot. So I think it's been helpful, and it's created a second kind of contact point with the students so that they can follow up with me individually or can find me a little bit easier after the fact.
Great way to provide different levels of support as well. Some students don't need much support at all. They've done this before and are ready to go. And some students really appreciate that additional level of support. And then I agree, Melissa, I find these frameworks really helpful because I'll go through sometimes and say, hey, you know, am I providing options for perception? Am I providing options for comprehension? We focused on just a few of the things this time, but I do like to look at the framework as a whole, particularly since I deal primarily with online instruction. And so things like perception and making sure that there are captions and things like that are also very important. Tiffany, you want to share more about your interactive portions?
Well, that was pretty much it. I think using interactive slides allows for those anonymous polls and allows for students to put into words what they got out of the session. And take time to frame questions that, you know, for those that are a little hesitant to speak up in a class format. And it works really well when you're online too, so.
Giving students opportunity to engage is highly aligned with UDL. And then I like the idea that you have in there that if it's recorded somewhere, it also makes it easier for you to go back and look at it more deeply and reflect on it later. So we're going to finish by opening this up to questions and answers that you have for either Eric and myself based on our presentations, or that you have for each other based on some of the things that you have shared. Feel free to either come off mute or put it into the chat.
Hi, this is Tiffany again. My question is for Jennifer. When you were talking about graphic organizers, I was wondering how or if you incorporate bibliographic tools like Zotero, you know, things like that.
I'm sorry, bibliographic tools like?
Zotero?
Oh, Zotero. Yeah, for this particular project, we don't really introduce new tools. They've got enough that they are learning about, so we keep it there. I do have LibGuides on using Zotero that most of the LibGuides that I have referenced that they have linked to and things through like the annotated bibliography, they've actually seen beforehand. They actually go through that entire LibGuide in their orientation course at Relay. So it's hopefully a review for them. But in some of those guides, I do mention tools like Zotero. And I have done some one-off instruction for those, but given that we don't do a lot of heavy research, learning a new tool like that has not been my highest priority for instructions, but we do have some guides and some research or videos and things on how to use those for students who want to make use of those tools. And then I see a question in the chat around, other than graphic organizers, what interactive elements do you recommend for completely virtual and asynchronous settings? Canvas is our learning management tool. So for asynchronous, we use that quite a bit. So discussion board postings and things like that. There are lots of other, you can create different linking instructional objects with various tools like Articulate and so on. We don't tend to use those very much because most of our instruction is synchronous or hybrid. But I don't know, Eric, do you have other interactive elements that you use for asynchronous settings?
I've tried, it's interesting because I tried a different kind of especially for synchronous online classes, which is common for our graduates. In New York State, you need to have a master's to go on to get your full professional license. So these are all of our master's, most of our master's classes are online. But I find that I've tried to use platforms and poll. I think Jamboards I've tried too, and Poll Everywhere, and a lot of those platforms. And I actually have come back to just using the Zoom chat in those online classes as a way for people to share their searches or to share citations that they have found that they find useful, sharing questions if they don't want to unmute. So it's gone, I guess it's not low tech, but just to minimize the number of different tabs and things that are open at the same time, because I feel like in an online instruction session, there's a lot of tabs that are already open. That's been my, I've been felt that it's also a lot easier to do those during kind of those formative assessments during instruction, to ask a question, to share a citation you found from doing this activity, as opposed to having to jump back and forth with different tabs and things like that.
Yeah, to that point, we've used different tools. We use Nearpod as our general tool that we use for synchronous instruction. You can use it for asynchronous as well. But to Eric's point, we really try to reduce the number of tools that we use because that adds another layer of cognitive load for students, and we want them to focus on content, not tools. So if we're introducing a new tool, it should be a tool that we can use over and over again. So for synchronous, we tend to stick to Zoom and tools within Zoom, and Nearpod and tools within Nearpod, although there are a lot of integrations that work with both. So we use a lot of Google Docs and Google Sheets. And similarly in Canvas. Canvas already has a number of tools for like discussion board postings, quizzes, things like that. So we tend to stick with some of those. We are doing a lot of experimentation right now with various AI tools and simulations and things like that that are in the beginning stages, but would not say we use those consistently yet. They're just being piloted. Other questions?
I have a question actually, and how I start off presentations. A question for you, Jennifer. Start off with talking about your experience planning this with your colleagues, the implementing the information search process into embedding that into the course. And I was wondering if you could talk about that planning experience with faculty.
Yeah, so this started out as a pilot that I did with a couple of faculty members that was like a small scale thing. So it was just one individual professor that I had a good relationship with. We talked about things and she's like, oh yeah, I want to try that. And so it was, instead of a capstone, it was the end of their first year course. Course that she was teaching on teaching methods. We did it in like 4 weeks instead of an entire semester. But we sort of planned out and just worked together on what this would look like, how we would plan through it. And that was a time where I actually sort of co-taught it with her, both synchronous and asynchronous. And so that gave us a chance to sort of just figure out what it looked like. Then we recently redesigned our entire master's program, which gave me a opportunity to be sort of on the ground floor and being like, hey, I have this idea. We need to figure out what our capstone looks like. Here is how it meets our accreditation requirements. Here is how it meets our goals for our institution. And then, I think here's how it meets information literacy, but that is less compelling to the education faculty. So I talk a lot about how all of this meets what their goals are and what they're looking for. And then it just also happens to meet my goals for information literacy. as well. So I have a really, the advantage of having a centrally designed curriculum is that I attend weekly meetings with our curriculum design faculty. I talk with a lot of them one-on-one. I really work on building those relationships so that I can really work to embed myself in those courses, because where I get frustrated is sort of what I named in that first slide, where it's like graduate students come to me with a research question on a project that has not been well defined, that they have not been supported on, and I'm trying to help them one-on-one with developing their research question, or things like that, where I'm like, if I designed this assignment myself, we would provide a lot more support from the very beginning. It would be more than a one-shot. And so I got in on that process just by long years of building relationships with faculty, becoming really embedded into our faculty departments. But it started out with one-shots. It started off with one-on-one relationships with a professor and trying something out with just one professor, or with just one or two classes or a one-shot, integrating some of those same principles, just on a much smaller scale, just adding a couple of reflection questions, just being like, okay, how do you develop a research question so that you can go into the library with, are you in the exploring stage and you're just trying to figure out what's out there, or are you in the gathering stage and you're looking for specific sources, and helping students think through that. Does that answer that question?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Yes, Rita, that's my feeling too, right? A lot of times, and I think Jennifer talked about this in her part of the presentation, that oftentimes research question is developing a research question is step one.
Experts find this really hard too, because professors have a lot of that background knowledge. And so when they go into their research, they have a much clearer sense of what they're looking for. And they aren't necessarily used to thinking through the information search process of an undergraduate student who has, doesn't have that wide, really broad and deep sense of what the education research is out there, or, whatever their field is. And so being able to help them think through. But even as an experienced researcher, it becomes second knowledge to you to oh, I'm in the stage where I'm just reading abstracts and collecting a bunch of stuff and doing some of that in a way that some students need explicitly explained to them, that there are different phases in the research project. Sorry, I think I interrupted you, Eric.
No, that's exactly right, right? And even just to have that experience to read through for action research, what's possible? What's a study that you find interesting that you want to replicate? I mean, just having some time and some resources at hand to, as opposed to an action research textbook. What are some studies? What are, and I think it becomes a less daunting assignment if you have some time to poke around and see what have been some projects in classroom action research, and it becomes a much, oh, you were analyzing exit tickets. That's something that becomes quite realistic for a working teacher. Now with that, we're nearing the end of the hour, so I think appreciate very much the questions that you've all had and your willingness to share your own practices in your classrooms.
Thank you all. Our emails are on the screen if you have any follow-up questions. Thanks for participating and staying through the end, because I know sometimes discussion's a scary part, and so appreciate you coming and sharing your ideas and practices.